when you set up your own AWS account, you require two things. You need, first of all, an email address, and you also need a password. Together, this will form an identity called the root user. Now, the root user is a powerful user. We call it sometimes also the super user of your account, and is the one that can do account level settings, like, for example, delete your account. For that reason, we typically do not recommend you to use the root user for day-to-day activities. On the contrary, one of the first tasks that our root user will do is to actually create an admin or administrator. Now, to use an administrator, to create an administrator, to give it permissions, we need a function called IAM, which stands for the Identity and Access Management Service. IAM actually does two things. First of all, it is used for the authentication. And second of all, it is used for the authorization. Authentication is all about the question, who? Who are you, and are you who you claim you are? So username, password is typically what we think about. The authorization is more about the what. What are you allowed to do? These are your permissions. So how do we define those permissions? Well, we'll do that through the use of a JSON style policy. And the way we remember easily what kind of fields we need to have into that JSON policy for each one of the statements, just remember about here. Because we need an effect. The effect will be either an allow or a deny. So are we allowing some permission or are we denying the permission? The action is basically the actual permission that we are using. And then finally, we have the resource upon which that action will be either allowed or denied. How can we do with this? We can attach this policy either to a IAM user, like for example our admin user that we're trying to create, a user group, which literally is a collection of users, which we generally recommend, because if you create for each individual user their permissions, you might have an inconsistent situation. By pre-creating a user group and attaching the permissions to the user group, we have a much more consistent configuration. And finally, also the role. Role is a really interesting one because the role represents temporary permissions. When someone assumes a role, they do not get all these permissions permanently, they get them on a temporary basis. Now, who can use those roles? The same users as before. In other words, our user has the choice either to have permanent permissions or temporary permissions. We can also use this for federated users. For example, a federated user would be defined by, let's say, Active Directory, which could be running in your on-prem, in your corporate data center, and that you would use as an identity provider to connect to IAM. And finally, the role is also very important for all our AWS services. An AWS service created in your account cannot talk to another AWS service in your same account if you don't give them the right permissions. And they will use a role for that.